Boom, we're in. Hey, so you have been missing from YouTube for a while, and we all noticed.
Yes,
and
it's been a long time. This is actually my glorious return.
Yeah, we frantically sent you emails, and apparently
yes,
they were all going in the bit bucket.
Yes, they were going into. I've lost a bunch of emails because of our switch over. Our university switched from Google to Microsoft, and emails that were outside of Virginia Tech, a fair number of those were going into the dustbin, and I was just missing them. And then you messaged me on YouTube, and I was like, "Hey, what's up?" And then you're like, "Oh, I've been emailing you." So
yeah, I'm surprised at how fast you got back to me, which was pretty cool. Anyway, we got a bunch of stuff, but somebody just did this really neat clip. I don't know if you've been following Dr. Dan.
A bit, yeah.
He did a thing with Sal Cordova about a week
ago.
ago.
I missed that. No.
Okay, on zinc fingers and protein orchards.
Awesome.
And this is sort of like a response, and Sal apparently put out this short video. I don't know, just maybe today or a while ago, and Aron Ra responded to it. So,
oh, cool.
I want to play it here.
Yeah, let's take a look.
It's just a short. Let's see if I can get it up here full screen. Oh, what are you? Oh, Restream, give me something here. I'm not sure what it was. Anyway, okay, maybe I can play it.
Mr. Ra, do you admit that Darwin's tree of life is wrong? No comment. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. Your Honor, these are catalogs of genes such as topoisomerase and zinc finger from both NIH and the ENCODE project. You'll find there are no examples of common ancestors to these genes, proving evolution is false. I submit these as Creationist exhibits Alpha and Bravo. You snotty little creationist, you and your pretty white suits don't realize that evolution saves lives. Do you admit to saying that proteins do not have a common ancestor? You darn right I did. Your Honor, I move to an immediate Article 38 Omaha to stop teaching the fairy tale of evolution. The atheist has rights.
Sal, why are you doing this to yourself, man?
Is this Sal?
This is Sal. Oh, this is his pet argument. And just like
topoisomerase. All right, hold on just a minute. Let me
just one more minute.
Make a note of that.
Listen, like everybody has been trying to warn him away from this argument for like 2 years. We're just like, Sal, this is not what like the slam dunk you think it is.
Well, there it is. I mean, like when I first heard it, I actually tried to be nice to Sal and emailed them and told them this argument is just like such bullshit. But then he worked for months on a presentation to some creationist conference about proteins don't have a common ancestor, therefore evolution is false. And it's like, oh my God. And it's like, not understanding the whole model that you would have to do for abiogenesis where there would be multiple little fragments of proteins, all developing, right? There wouldn't be a common ancestor.
Yes.
And Cell just doesn't get it.
Or that the pattern of what we see is replacement of amino acids of the topoisomerase protein sequence, or if you look at the genes, same thing, that pattern follows exactly what you would expect to see if animals have descended through common descent and natural selection. We see exactly that pattern. And it doesn't matter what you look at. Like my video where I walked through this with him with the potassium channel, that was the one that I think the first video that you saw of mine that kind of got us together. It utterly, like, he has no explanation whatsoever for why you would see say, like similar topoisomerases in animals that look very different, but actually are more closely related to each other because, say, that they're marsupial versus placental.
Yeah, but that's what he's talking about. Is he thinks that topoisomerase and the zinc finger families should have a common ancestor.
Right.
Evolution is correct, right?
Yes, of course.
And they don't, of course.
No, of course not. Yes.
Because
yes. That part is ridiculous. But
it is.
Then you could even look within topoisomerase and look at the sequences and do exactly what I did for the potassium channel. And that there are actually, like, going to be
any one family will trace all the way back.
Of course.
But he's claiming that all families,
yes, all proteins must have descended from a single protein.
So according, and when you criticize him on it, he says, "I'm not claiming that I'm claiming that it's a protein orchard, and it's so are we." And he just can't put it together with evolution. So, in his model, in his little tiny mind, he thinks there was a cell with one protein in it, right? That was a common ancestor, and that one protein divided up,
Right.
Just totally not understanding that a cell with one protein would not work.
No.
It's like, oh my goodness.
Yes, exactly.
And he's gone and done talks and he's done lectures and people are just eating it up. And it's like, and I'm just,
because it sounds sophisticated to a creationist audience.
It does. Yeah. It's just like, I don't know. I'm arguing with a couple of Christians on a couple of different things like that. And what I came to is that they have all this redefined living is asking me, what is your primal non-contingent source of all reality? And I said, reality.
Sure.
And he says, God. Okay. And the difference is that when he says God, he thinks God had his little fingers in there in his mind and designed it, right?
Right.
And for me, we just accept reality as sort of a brute fact, right? That this is what we have, right?
Yes.
And basically, it's a difference in two kinds of people almost. And let's see if I got it here. Yeah, okay, that's what it is. The north-going Zax and the south-going Zax, right?
Yeah.
It's like. It's an emotional argument. It has nothing to do with rationality. It's almost like whatever you prefer to believe. If you cannot, you just like I worship nature and complexity, right? And these guys worship God, and we're kind of in the same boat in a way. But they never quite come to that understanding the way I have. I think I don't know.
No, they won't, because if they're assumed priors.
Yeah.
They operate from the assumption that there is a deity named God, and then they have to accept that the Bible is 100% true and that all the things described therein are true. And so therefore everything else in reality has to match that prior assumption. It's the basic way the conspiracy theorists work. They start with the end, and then they go and look at the world to find supporting data that supports their end conclusion, and then totally disregard anything that contradicts it.
Yeah.
Whereas you are operating from the stance of, I'm going to just look at the world, then kind of establish some patterns that I see there, make some hypotheses about the way things work, then look for evidence that may disprove that or support it. And then build on a world model that works like that, right?
Yeah. It's just a matter of two ways of thinking: one that works and one that doesn't.
Yeah, well, ultimately that's what it is. Because when you use conspiracy-minded thinking, you end up with stuff like ivermectin cures COVID, and vaccines cause autism, and contrails are poisoning the minds and controlling the populace, and that Noah had an ark that was filled with the animals that we see today. I mean, like that's how conspiracy thinking works.
Yeah.
And young earth creationism is conspiracy thinking for sure. And
the really horrible thing about it that I've come to realize is Answers in Genesis is a multi-$100 million organization. I mean, they raise hundreds of millions a year.
Oh yeah.
And they just recently, my great nieces, both of them, took their families out. I have two great nieces, and they took their families out, including the children, out to AIG to attend the homeschooling conference. And they're bringing up these little kids in this weird creationist worldview and locking them in a box so that they can't associate with other kids other than, other Baptists in their church or whatever the hell denomination they are. There's some sort of fundy and it just breaks my heart to see that happen within my own family.
Sure.
And if it's happening within my family, how many other families are doing the same thing? I mean, it's just
lots and lots. Yeah.
That's horrible.
Sure.
Anyway.
Right.
Yep. So, go ahead.
I was going to say, a lot of religious, and not all religious thinking works this way, but the fundamentalist religious thinking operates in a way where you assume your priors and then you look for evidence in the world to support that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just, I look at it developmentally, like when you have to choose an epistemology, okay, like epistemologists will get on and argue on they'll argue for centuries over what the proper foundation for epistemology is. And the thing is that all human beings develop in the very same way. All animals do. Right. We get our epistemology from the world around us, right? And it carves, it basically interacts with our brains and creates our what we, or our epistos, what we see as the world, right?
That's right.
And naturalists just kind of embrace that and say, okay, this is the world we find ourselves in. Let's figure out how it works from there. And I call that R1 or reality one. Basically, it's a reality that all animals have about how things work. We know that there are two sides, to every, to objects, and we understand three-dimensional space and all of that. And everybody operates in that natural world. No matter what your belief system, you feed yourself with a spoon and fork, or by lifting things to your mouth. And I call that R1. And then R2, which is science, is kind of an extension of that same kind of discovery and thinking to create, the structure that we have created called modern science, which is quite intricate and quite well done. Right. I mean, so I say that everybody is a naturalist to begin with, right? When you get out of bed in the morning, you're a naturalist. Maybe 5 minutes later, you will start to praise Jesus or praise God, but you were a naturalist when you woke up.
Absolutely.
Get out of bed. Right. That's how you put your pants on.
Yeah. And the thing about, I think you're absolutely right. There's a default way of thinking that humans have, and also animals have. Like, they will learn from experience and draw conclusions about how the world works. Now, that default method has flaws in it. It's not perfect. It has, the sensory systems, for instance, are not perfect. They can be deceived in many ways. And then, of course, the way we draw conclusions is dependent upon experience, but we can, the way we draw those conclusions sometimes can be too reified or too set in stone when it's false. We have a hard time disproving or letting go of things, naturally that we have learned to be associated, right? But it works well as from a natural selection perspective, and allows people and animals to reproduce and create progeny, and it's been a successful tool, like this mechanism by which brains work. Now, humans have made that a little bit more sophisticated, and we've added the scientific method to ensure rigor and getting at the capital T truth as close as we can. But the religionists kind of do the opposite. They really actually are working against our larger instincts of accepting of what is true in the world based on our actual experience and updating our understanding of what is true in the world. Now, they do it, of course, like they still do it the way the natural mechanisms work. But when it comes to those, that worldview priors that they build into their understanding of the world, their overall epistemology, where they cannot violate those priors, well, they do all kinds of gymnastics to try to make those things true.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's when they hit that crisis. Some of them will hit a crisis of faith, and it'll be this big dramatic thing. And oftentimes, if they switch from being ultra religious, they tend to be even more ultra atheist when they switch, and doing the opposite. Yeah. So.
Yep.
Anyway.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the split brain, Iain McGilchrist.
Yeah.
McGilchrist.
McGilchrist. Yeah. I'd never heard of him before.
I run into him about a year or two ago.
Okay.
And he's an interesting case. He's a really interesting case. Here he is, and I linked the video. I don't know if we play any of it, but maybe I'll play just a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead, play. Yeah.
I may be at the section where it sets it up.
I don't want to repeat myself. We haven't got time to repeat myself. But this distinction between mythos and you see, mythos is not what we mean by myth is a lie. A mythos may contain truth. And when one talks about God being born in this way and suffering and dying, there is a truth in that, which is not equaled by any other story, any other revelation, any other idea about the nature of the creation and the nature of the cosmos that I know. And
anyway, so where he starts out is with the two hemispheres of the brain.
Right.
So what do you like? We know that there is something going on with the two hemispheres of the brain.
Yeah.
The left side and the right side. Like I think it's is it Broca's area on the left side. If you lose that, you cannot form regular speech, but you can swear. Like I knew an individual who had a damaged temporal lobe, and he was I think he was about 30 years old, and he was very dysfunctional. But I was growing up. I was about 8 years old when I met him, and all he would do is sit around and swear. And apparently, if your right temporal lobe is intact, you can swear. But then there are people who have the opposite damage. Right. They can talk well, but they can't emote.
They can't emote. Yes.
Yeah, they
so that the addition of emotion to language, and also the understanding of emotion in language, seems to be run primarily on the right side of the brain.
Yeah.
And we refer to that, adding emotion to speech is known as prosody. And so people who have right side damage or say strokes in those areas of the brain, like in the temporal lobe, like we're talking about, that are important for the language centers in the right side of the brain, they speak with very flat affect. They have no emotion in their language. And obviously, like when people speak completely flat and monotone, we immediately recognize that as being like weird. Especially since part of communication is the inflection of your voice and adding emotion to it. Like we convey a lot of meaning through that. Neuroscientists generally know all that quite well, and all of that has really worked out. And I felt like the beginning of that conversation that McGilchrist had with Alex O'Connor was really interesting. I was like, oh, I didn't know about this. There's a lot of stuff in there I didn't really know. Because I'll be frank, other than language being lateralized, which many neuroscientists know, and there's a lot of research on lateralization. Many neuroscientists kind of ignore lateralization in the brain. They don't necessarily pay attention to if there are big differences between the left side and the right side. Partly that's because for some things, that lateralization doesn't actually matter that much. For instance, like the motor cortex, the left side of my brain that is the motor cortex is controlling the right side of my body, and the right side is controlling the left side of my body. And they're mirrored. They're basically the same. They're just mirrors of each other. Auditory cortex, similar thing. Like not that it's flipped, but that it's one side and the other side. Like they basically do the same thing, as far as I know. But I think that there's a lot. I would suspect that when you get into things like the prefrontal cortex and the frontal cortex, these areas that are doing more complicated calculations and have certain roles and reasoning and logic, I bet there's lateralization that we're just completely unaware of.
Yeah.
And then it may fall into these domains that McGilchrist was talking about, with the left side being more, logically oriented and categorization oriented, whereas the right side being more focused on the emotional salience of things.
Yeah.
I bet that's true. I mean, because we definitely know that's true with language.
Yeah.
And he seemed to point to some really interesting evidence even in animal models that I was totally unaware of. And if that lateralization can also be found in reptiles and birds, and if it truly is something that a last common ancestor of all vertebrates had, I mean, then that would mean all mammals have that too. Just
Right.
I haven't done the work to see.
I think
I've been meaning to look that up for the last couple of days, but I've been busy. But
primates, the corpus callosum that hooks the two hemispheres together. In primates, I think is it bigger than any other animal, or is it smaller? I think it's smaller. I'm not.
In humans,
Yeah, I can't
the
remember.
corpus callosum, is it bigger than it is in any other animal? It's a great question. I don't know.
Corpus callosum. Relative.
Yeah.
In mammals.
I bet it's probably smaller relative to the entire cortex, because our cortex is relatively large. But of course, most of the is that right? It's smaller than other animals.
Oh yeah. Well, no, I'm not sure about other animals. Let's see, relatively smaller in humans than other primates.
Okay,
no, that's surprising.
And then I would imagine then it's smaller in primates relative to
other animals.
Yeah, to like rodents and other animals.
Right. And I wonder if that is the evolution of basically rationality and logical thinking,
right,
planning, and that basically created a division between those two hemispheres, so that our emotional side doesn't interfere as much with our planning. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think some of what McGilchrist made a lot of sense to me, in that there may be specialization that has happened across the hemispheres having to do with our ability to categorize and understand the world being primarily in the left, but our ability to sense the world, especially as far as its emotional salience, being either fearful or happy or those kinds of things, being largely dictated by the right side. And those are big, broad categories that obviously have to interact at some way. But it's not, the brain isn't split to allow for these two functions to coexist. That's not the reason why the brain is split. The brain is split is because we are bilateral symmetrical, and things have to be mirrored on both sides for the most part. And the fact that it is lateralized is fascinating in itself, because for the most part, our entire bodies are largely just like a bilateral symmetrical organization. Of course, like when you get into the internal organs, you obviously differences. That's stuff that emerges during development. Same thing, of course, for our brains. But our brains are much more, at least superficially, bilateral symmetrical, and even functionally in many ways, than most of our internal organs.
Yeah.
And
if the theory I like most is that thinking and rationality developed off of the same structure as our motor system, right? Our motor system was already lateralized, right? Had to be lateralized.
I totally disagree with that. The motor system's not lateralized. It is very bilateral symmetrical.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's one of the good examples of things that is not lateralized. Because you have largely the same kind, like I said, the motor cortex, the premotor cortex, even the somatosensory cortex is on the right side of my brain is a reflection of and controls the left side of my body. And then the right side controls the left side of my brain controls the right side of my body and senses the right side of my body. And they are essentially mirrors of each other.
Yeah, but they're mirrors of each other, but they're on two sides.
They're on two sides. Oh, yeah, when you're saying lateralized,
Yeah.
When
That's
I
what I
say
mean.
okay, we're not saying the same thing.
Yeah,
When I
it's
say lateralized, I'm
but
saying
then
that they are not balanced.
yeah,
So if they're bilateral symmetrical, that is not lateralization. Lateralization
would
refers
be a
to
difference.
specifically a difference.
A difference. Okay.
That's what
So,
lateralization means.
yeah, but then okay, if it developed from the motor system, it would have been identical on both sides. It wouldn't have mattered. But further evolution and specialization probably made that lateralize in the sense that you're talking about.
Yes.
It was different on one side.
Right.
And it became our speech, it developed on the left side, or some people I think it's on the right side or whatever. But it became more specialized, and there's a whole interplay between the motor system and the basal ganglia. And then if you look at primates, okay, the caudate nucleus, which is I think the main input for
from the parts of the cortex,
right?
Yes,
or the striatum, right?
Right. Caudate and striatum are synonyms of each other. The striatum includes the caudate and the putamen. And that they're both, the caudate and putamen aren't exactly identical, but they're basically the same kinds of neurons.
But now, when I was studying anatomy, if you look at humans compared to other primates, we have the caudate is right around. It goes right around the what is it? The lateral ventricle.
Yeah, it's underneath the lateral ventricle. Yeah.
Yep. If you look at humans, we have a big swelling toward the front of the lateral ventricle, where the caudate is more swollen. And those parts of the caudate are hooked up to our frontal cortex, not our motor cortex.
That's right. Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense.
That's also true in other mammals as well.
Yeah. Well, it's more so in humans.
It is more so in humans. And that's because we are highly encephalized, particularly within the cortex. So we have a much larger percentage. Humans overall have a much larger percentage of our brains dedicated to prefrontal cortex than any other mammal. And then primates have a larger prefrontal cortex relative to any other mammal. Humans are the king of that. And then whales and other pinnipeds have also a pretty large prefrontal cortex relative to their brains, but not quite as big as primates, or at least not as big as the apes, and not nearly as big as humans. And so therefore, of course, if those areas are getting input to the striatum, or if they're providing input to the striatum that's receiving the input from those prefrontal and frontal cortices, then of course that part of the striatum is going to be larger as well, because these are integrated systems. And like you said, like those are not motor systems per se. They're related to motivational type things and logic and learning, and not directly motor,
sequential thinking and sequential language, which would almost have a parallel in sequential body movements, like walking or striding or doing something, which is really interesting. So what McGilchrist is saying is that right side of the brain would be the side you get in touch with when you do like a Buddhist meditation, or you have a spiritual experience, or you're just sitting there not thinking about anything. You're just enjoying, right?
Yeah, I think what he's largely arguing is that like the right side of the brain is largely interested in and entrained to emotional experiences, and that the left side is largely entrained to categorization, logical thinking, those kinds of things. And I think that's probably true. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, and I'm sure that on the details that's wrong. And then as we also pointed out, other things like motor and sensory information, the somatosensory cortex in particular, is not lateralized, it is bilateral symmetrical. So it doesn't fall into those categories. But these other areas that do, so one way to think of the brain is there's sensory input. That's a big part of what the brain does. It takes in information from our senses. And then, of course, another big thing is motor output. So that already is a big part of what the brain does. And those things are largely bilateral symmetrical. They're not very, that you're not seeing asymmetry. Now, to connect sensory input and motor output, there's stuff in between. And that stuff in between, like understanding language, paying attention to language, creating language, to feed that into the language centers, the motor areas that control our vocal output, or the logical thinking or motivational, like those things are probably lateralized in many ways. And I think a lot of that we don't actually really know, partly because it's hard to interrogate these areas. Like it's not easy to figure out like what the orbital prefrontal cortex is doing. We know a fair amount about it, but we don't know in great detail like what's actually happening there.
Yeah, I was reading about language and the basal ganglia and the wiring and like the arcuate fasciculus and the what is it, uncinate fasciculus, and they can't even decide now on the fiber tracks. You know, they're still trying to work that anatomy out because it's very, very difficult to figure out exactly, because the tracks all run into each other.
They all tend to run into each other. That can be difficult to pull out in an fMRI machine. And there's variability. That's the other thing. Like you look at one person's brain and another person's brain, they're not going to look exactly the same. On the larger gross anatomy, yes, but there's variability for sure. And even within an individual across time, there's variability. The person's brain when they're 20 is different than the way it looks when they're 60. It just looks different.
Yep. I noticed this morning when I pull up papers, the first thing I do is I rename the paper. So I have a PDF document, and I have my monitors are 3 feet wide, and I have 2 of them. So I have 6 feet of monitor, right, going across in front of me. When I pull up the document, PDF always puts it way on my left monitor on the left side. I cannot work that way. I can't read the paper. I can't understand the paper, and I can't even rename the paper. I have to drag it over here so it's on the right side of my visual field. And then I can work. I just noticed that this morning when I was anticipating talking to you.
So you might have a split brain issue. That's one thing that we've learned a lot about the way lateralization works is with patients, like epileptic patients who have had their corpus callosum cut. So that is one way that, and this is a surgery that still is done today. It still sounds like, you know, from archaic science where they were doing lobotomies, and certainly it was done back then, but it largely doesn't do too much to the individual. It doesn't affect them that much, and it can have beneficial effects to epileptic patients who have these really severe grand mal seizures. And we learn crazy things about the way the left side versus the right side works. And based on exactly what you're talking about, because the right field of view ends up on the left side of the brain, and then the left field of view ends up on the right side of the brain, but it's split within the eyes because our eyes are forward facing. This is one thing that McGilchrist talked about. Our eyes are actually forward facing. So the eyes both end up going to both sides of the brain, but it splits the field of view, which is super cool. There's
some crossover.
There's a crossover, but just only some of the axons crossover, and then some stay on the same side and end up projecting to the lateral geniculate nucleus to be on the same side. I also saw in the chat, Base Theory said hi. I haven't seen it. I've been watching some of his videos, and he's great. I want to say hi to him, to acknowledge him.
Anyway,
he's doing a great job. I saw that he just hit 2K subscribers.
Leo's here.
Even more. So if anyone's watching and is not subscribed, they should.
Icarus is here, and Blessed Be He is our religious guy. He's talking about qualia and stuff like that. Oh, we haven't explained qualia and all that stuff.
Okay.
But anyway, but the lateralizations. Now it's interesting. If you do nothing but think on your left side of your brain, there are some people, me among them, that feel that you will become more and more miserable, that you need that right side stimulus. You need to go out in the woods and just kind of let both sides come in, flow in for a while. And I think a lot of the ills of modern society is, and McGilchrist started out talking about that We are trained to use that left side way too much. And
Yeah.
we let the right side in order to get this emotional balance.
Yeah, he did say that, and I can appreciate where that's coming from. Now, at the same time, I felt a little called out. I mean, I'm a scientist, so obviously, if we're going to give any truth to this left side versus right side thing, I'm going to be like, well, all right, I think I might spend a little too much on my left side, but I will also say, he mentioned that, like, okay, a larger sort of spiritual thinking allows one to have appreciation for the arts and the humanities, and that if you're too left brain thinking, you can't appreciate those things.
Right.
I was like, and Alex O'Connor talks about this too, and this bugs me about him, because he gets in a little too much into the side of, like, well, I also agree with the religious people that we don't really know how the brain works, and that, like, consciousness can't be explained. And he's a little too open-minded, I think, in those things, because consciousness is utterly going to be a mechanistic thing. It has to be based in physical reality. It's not going to be something that's open to, I don't know, quantum entanglement or like string theory. He seems to entertain some of that garbage, and I think it's mostly just because it's fair. He just doesn't really have a great grasp of the way the brain works,
right?
And that bugs me a little bit about when he talks to. When he talks about neuroscience?
I thought he was a neuroscientist. What is it?
Alex O'Connor? I don't know what he's trained in. He's not a neuroscientist.
No, not Alex.
Alex McGilchrist. I don't know what he is. I think that he may be a philosopher of science, particularly focused on biology. I'm not entirely sure, but I think he's a philosopher first. Maybe he's a neuroscientist. I could be wrong on that, but some of what he was saying, I wouldn't say there was any neuroscience specifically that he said that was wrong. And I certainly learned a lot from the conversation just about neuroscience. So it's an interesting conversation to listen to, especially the first half. I think the second half kind of goes off the rails. We both felt that way. We were talking about an email.
He's a psychiatrist.
A psychiatrist. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Neuroscience researcher, philosopher, and a literary scholar.
And I think he focuses mostly on the philosophy of psychiatry.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And then, but the interesting thing is he was going on and he started to basically claiming that this right side of the brain was somehow finding more truth than the left side of the brain, right? Than the scientific rationality thing. Isn't that kind of what you got out of the last half of his thing when he started to go off on?
Yes.
He was claiming we got to do this right brain thinking, right?
Right. But then I felt like he was getting into almost Jordan Peterson territory with the way he was talking about it all.
Exactly.
Yes. And that was really annoying.
But here's the interesting thing about that. Okay. If you go to this right brain mythos, art, emotional appreciation, intuitive type of thinking, right? If you stay over there, fine, you're going to have a wonderful spiritual feeling experience, right? But as soon as you start doing what he's doing, which is turning it into some sort of a worldview,
yes,
you popped over to the left side of your brain again.
Right. Yes.
So what he's doing is he's taking these ideas from the right and trying to reify them in some sort of rational worldview or prescription. Like you ought to do this, you ought to do that, right?
Right.
That's all left-sided thinking. So what he's doing is he's making the mistake of going back to the left side with bad information, which is, I think, what most religious people do.
I think so. Yes.
They get a feeling, you get a feeling, and it's like.
Yes. And then that's now supposed to inform the worldview that, say, the left side forms. Now, again, this is simplistic, but that opens one up to that conspiracy-minded thinking that we were talking about right at the beginning, and where you're then letting your priors and your emotions dictate your understanding of the world, irrespective of what you actually see in the world. And then he was saying certain things that were just like, well, I mean, clearly just flaws in logic. He was basically saying that, like, the law of the excluded middle, well, that just doesn't apply to all things. Like with God, it doesn't apply. And, I don't know. For me, and this is one thing that kind of annoys me about Alex O'Connor. I see Leo Phyllis in the chat pointed out that Alex O'Connor got his degree in theology and philosophy from Oxford. That makes sense. When we are talking about, God, quote unquote, consciousness, quote unquote, I think these things need to be defined. And, they'll operate on the assumption that everyone agrees on what those terms mean. And they touched on this a little bit when they talked about, well, we give God these human attributes such as loving and benevolent and omnipresent and omnipotent. Now, first of all, no, we don't. Like, those are not human attributes. Is he loving? Okay, that's a human attribute. But benevolent, that is a meaningless term.
Yeah.
Omnipotent is a meaningless term. Yeah. Omnipresent is a meaningless term. That's an oxymoron. Those terms mean nothing because they are absence of things. They are defined in a way that you cannot define them. Yeah. If I tell someone that I believe that red oak trees exist, for instance, I believe that these things exist. I have to define a little bit of what I mean, and I can use real things to define what that means. Now, if I want to say something that's more of a concept or an action, I can describe those concepts and actions. For instance, love. Like, I can talk about the concept of love and get into those things. Those are not necessarily going to be reified, but they are still concepts that are based on real things and real observable behaviors and real observable actions that exist in the world. If you were going to define a thing using words that are meaningless, that doesn't tell me anything about that thing. And I get very frustrated in these conversations because we'll talk about God even saying he. I mean, I even use the word he, the pronoun he.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Oh, does that mean that it is a male, that it's XY chrome? Like, what does it mean that God is a male?
Penis? Does he have a penis?
Right, exactly. And it doesn't mean anything, like, because I don't know. They have the conception of an entity. And I mean, it might even be the way it's portrayed in, Michelangelo's paintings and, or how it's described in the Bible. But then when they make these arguments, they'll just ignore a lot of that stuff and just assume all of that is true. But, like, you see what I'm getting at? Like, it's so frustrating.
Yeah. The thing is, they never want to talk about this. They want to talk about, omniscient, omnibenevolent.
Yes.
Well,
then define those things. What does that mean to be omnipotent?
Yeah.
It means power without limit.
Right.
But that means that if something is without something, like, then that means it actually doesn't have any definition. There's no defining it. Defining means you put a box around and describe what it is. Yeah.
Can't do anything. The thing they don't want to talk about is that they imagine a God that has plans, right? So their God has plans for us. Okay. He's planning the world. He's planning everything. He has a will, basically, that he can do things to us. Like, he can cause a huge worldwide flood. And he also has emotions because he gets pissed off at us. And so what are they talking about? They're talking about a mammalian agent.
Yes.
They're talking about us. And it's definitely anthropomorphic.
It anthropomorphizes it, yes.
And that is that just seems to me to be the most unhumble thing ever. But the point that I always try, the reason that I am a hard atheist is that I don't believe in agents of any kind that are not based on biological life, that are not based on an organism. Emotions come from the limbic system. The planning comes from that left brain. All of that.
These concepts and these behaviors of planning, will, or say motivation, emotion, we know that there are neural correlates of those things. We can see it in humans. We can see it in animal models. We know how that works. We do. we know an awful lot of how that works. We
Yeah.
can look at the neural correlates of the things. We can manipulate the experiences within an animal model by manipulating those circuits. The only way that we can see those concepts of planning, motivation, or will and emotions is utterly rooted in biological tissue. Actually, base theory has a great question in here. You don't believe that it's possible for AI to have agency? I've got some thoughts about that.
Oh yeah, AI. Well, that agency would almost have to be be sewn into the structure of the AI.
I disagree.
Do you?
Yes.
Okay.
First of all, I do agree that it's possible for AI to have some agency, and I don't think that it necessarily has to be sewn in or programmed in. I think that actually you could probably get an entity that has some kind of agency through the iterative process that largely the large language models are working on. Like, I don't think, like, in fact, the reason why we've seen a big advance in these large language models and in AI is because they have gotten away from programming and having someone inserting these things. And then instead they're using the creative power of, which is essentially a Darwinian natural selection process, to, unlock actually like some really great advancements in the way that these things work. And so I don't think that you have to have that in there. And I do think that, right now we only see it in biological organisms, but I don't think that won't necessarily be true in the future. In fact, it might even be pretty true in the near future.
Yeah. Okay. In order for it to react, you have to ask it a question. Okay. You have to start something. Now, when we get out of bed in the morning, we have this reticular activating system pumping dopamine and cholinergic transmitters up into our, into the whole of our brain, right? And that,
in addition to, one thing that's underappreciated is that it also stimulates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
Yep.
So our levels of adrenaline are the lowest when we're just before we're waking up, and then it starts to go up. That adrenaline surge is one thing that just kind of gets our body going.
Yeah. So that's what I mean. We have to sew that sort of thing in. So if every day the AI basically had a little wake up thing, right?
Yeah.
Said, okay, start doing something, start seeking. Like on ChatGPT, my ChatGPT is just sitting there and I ask it a question.
Yeah.
Well, if we were to start to develop a consciousness in AI, my ChatGPT would say, "Hey, Mike, what's up this morning?" It would contact me. I wouldn't contact it. Okay. There's a difference.
Sure. But I mean,
how are you going to get that to happen?
So I don't think the consciousness has to reflect if we see an artificial consciousness, I don't think that it necessarily has to reflect what we see in humans. That it will be something that is very similar to, but not identical. So I don't necessarily expect it to have, say, a circadian pattern. I think that there's some artificial selection happening in artificial intelligence for sure, right? So we are making artificial intelligence to fit our needs. But because of the iterative process by which we create these large language models, we're getting a ton of creativity that seems to be popping out in ways that we really couldn't necessarily even program ourselves.
Oh yeah.
Right. And that's one of the exciting things I think about.
So you're suggesting that this thing is going to run some sort of a natural selection route where it's going to start to develop some complexity that we had not counted on.
Yeah. And I think that I could imagine a scenario where they set up this iterative process in a way that allows it to be more flexible and doing more things, and where it's not being artificially selected, but say naturally selected in some kind of way. Now, that also means that you'd have to give it the play, the ability to, the space in order to do that.
Yeah.
And I'm also getting a little bit out of my field of expertise. I mean, not a little bit, but a lot out of my field of expertise.
Yeah, I think
I'm speculating here on a lot of things for sure.
I think the way they train these things up is they give it a snapshot data. They have data set and they run through that entire data set. Well, What we'd want to do is have a cycle where every day it woke up and started looking around the internet to see what's new.
Sure. Well, I think that they're basically doing that just nonstop. I don't think that they have a circadian pattern or anything like that.
I think they've got it kind of fixed, but I'm not sure. I think the last update came up to like April of this year or something like that on the internet. 4.0D or so, whatever.
It was 4.0 or 4.0. That's the newest ChatGPT. Well, at least the one that's available publicly.
Yeah. I pay for one, so I get the.
Yeah, I pay for it too. I actually use it in my own work.
I use it constantly. I mean, it just simplifies so much. It's just the most amazing tool I've ever found.
I agree. Yeah, so, I think that it's been hugely helpful. Yeah.
So my argument for coming up with if we really want to come up with something that we would call a conscious agent, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first thing we start with is the RAS, reticular activating system, that basically wakes it up in the morning and starts to motivate it to go around and talk to people or look at things and starts inputting.
Yes.
The other thing we would give it is a really good model of our world in space and time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, apparently it's getting that just from the language,
right?
Which really surprised them. But
yes,
that may be enough. But it's got to have something happening in the way. It's got to have some embodiment, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, yes, I agree. I actually agree with that. Now that I agree with a lot, and I kind of see more of what you're getting at. Yeah. I don't know if it necessarily has to be an exact copy of, say, something that humans have, or even similar, close to it. But I do agree that one, it needs to have sensory input and the ability to have an output and then learn from those outputs and then change its behavior next time.
Yeah.
Yes. And right. I was going to say, like, that sensory input right now is simply just feeding it a crap load of data off the internet and then giving it the ability, like the large language models already have the ability to have, I don't know, some understanding, for lack of a better word, of the predictive nature of language.
Yeah.
And, I think we put human consciousness too high on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And partly it's because we don't define necessarily what consciousness is. And it's hard to really define it, like what that word means. Many times it seems to get, instead of like a God of the gaps issue where God just gets smaller and smaller and put into smaller boxes, with consciousness, we're often finding that the definition of consciousness gets smaller and smaller, largely because the things that we before used to describe as consciousness being the result of a spirit or a ghost. So I would say, like, consciousness suffers from the ghost of the gaps problem, where the ghost just gets smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
And now it's down to the things where we just don't have good neurobiological theories and mechanisms to fully explain those phenomena, such as our understanding of qualia, or some of the higher order logical processing that occurs in brains.
I think if you look at all of the easy problems in consciousness,
mm-hmm.
If you consider all of the easy problems together and what's really happening, you have solved the hard problem of consciousness. There is no observer inside of us. There's like the idea like of a neural correlate of consciousness, that something is happening in the brain that's going to give us this consciousness. But in order for that to happen, as Dennett pointed out, you have to already have an observer to observe that, to absorb that neural correlate happening.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's happening is our brain, we're trying to understand our consciousness with consciousness, and you can't do that. You can't do that. The only thing you can understand is your memory. You don't have an actual, I have a diagram here. Let me see where it is. Let's see, PTFC. And this is kind of the thinking that I went through in order to understand consciousness. Is I'm not sure if you can read that or not.
I can. Yeah. Well, what's the top little blue blob?
Okay, the top blue blob. Oh God, I can't read it myself.
It says sound. No, what's it say? Sound-based.
Hang on a second.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, sound-based distracting thought, I think.
Oh, okay.
Is.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, I can read it.
So anyway, so it's called ribbons. Now the top one here, and you can see my cursor. Top part here is our subjectivity.
Mhm.
And the only way to get at that is to run tests on people and over again and say, okay, can you give me a narrative about what you were subjectively feeling, right? What are you conscious of? And they're going to come up with a narrative, and there's going to be 100 different narratives. And it's going to be really a bit. On the bottom here, this green bar is what's actually happening in the brain, right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And this green bar will extend pages and pages and pages down.
Yes.
With, what's happening in the basal ganglia, what's happening in the, this nucleus and that nucleus.
Visual cortex. Yeah.
And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to find a point in time, right, where consciousness is happening. Where, if you turn your head and see a red field of things or a red cup, right? Scott hates my red kitty qualia cup. But when you look at that red cup, it starts right here. You are not conscious of it for about 200 milliseconds. And then the thing is that you are staring at that cup through time. So the whole time you're thinking about what it is to have the qualia of a red cup, you're getting new red cup information, which is 200 milliseconds delayed. And it's coming in and it's modifying what you think is happening with you.
Sure.
The reason that we believe that we have access to our consciousness is because some things stay fixed for a while. Stay fixed long enough for us to not only get new input, but to be able to remember the input that we just had.
That's right.
And most of what we're doing is remembering what was going on. And the other thing about consciousness is that this shows like a time swath. Basically, it would go out to about here. There'd be a swath of time going backwards. And that whole section of time, like about 200 milliseconds, for us is all bunched together into one qualic experience, one qualitative experience. A lot of things are happening to us in that 200 milliseconds, and we're munching them all together. We have a brush going across time, and we're accumulating a lot of information, condensing 200 milliseconds to a second of experience into what we think is the now. Yes. And for us, it's the now. And in order to actually figure out what's happening in consciousness, you have to develop these ribbons. On the top, I have here seeing red, okay? And then about 200 milliseconds later, you start to find this complexes of second order associations with red. Like what I noticed when I did I've done a lot of work with introspection. When I looked at something red, all of a sudden I had kind of a remnant of a memory of a stop sign, a stoplight, a blood.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Sure.
So there's all these second order complexes that come in. And also the word red. The word red pops up about out here somewhere.
Sure.
Where all of a sudden I'll have a name for it. Now something, and if you were to look at on the bottom here, the physical layer, you would be adding layer after layer after layer, the linguistic layer, the cognitive layer, the basically the association layers and all of that. And then when you quit seeing red, you're out here trying to figure out, well, I was conscious of seeing red. Well, you can't be conscious of seeing red when you're not seeing it anymore. So obviously we're remembering it. But the thing is that out here, if you were to ask the person right here, like that's what this bubble is for, is we ask the participant a question. What are you seeing right now? But what are you conscious of right now, right? And of course, he's seeing the red here, and then we shut the red off right here. And then out here, he has to say, oh, I was conscious of red.
Right.
How the hell does he know that he was conscious of red?
Well,
it could have been, it could have been that he was conscious of having seen a red thing, but at the time he was more focusing on something entirely different, like a pain in his toe or whatever. The thing is, you can never know what you were conscious of or were unconscious of. And that's the thing about trying to capture our own consciousness that hit me.
I see what you mean. I don't know if that's necessarily the case.
Okay.
That's because these experiences that you have. So for instance, seeing red, or walking across a field that's got a tree over here, a garbage can over here, a path this way that goes to the left. That's all a visual experience.
Yeah.
That, yes, in the moment, of course, you're seeing those things. And if you could ask the person, what do you see right now? That person could sit there and describe those things. But, you know, when, 5 minutes later, you could ask that person, well, what did you see 5 minutes ago when you were back this other way? They could still describe what they saw, because there are neural circuits that retain that sensory information.
Yeah, working memory in your hippocampus.
Yeah, in the hippocampus.
Yeah, there's a tendency to refire again.
Yes.
But if you were to say, ask the person to absolutely prove that I was conscious of that tree 5 minutes ago, well, they couldn't. You have no way of knowing, right?
Sure. You wouldn't be able to have absolute proof. Yeah. But honestly, we don't necessarily need that to know that person was conscious of that. And I would say that they, you could look at the neural activity of the ensemble of neurons that were firing at that moment. And then when the person is trying to recall what they saw 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, or even the next day, you would likely see the same ensemble firing. You could look for that same exact ensemble. And we can, in fact, even manipulate the ensemble of neurons that fire when an animal is experiencing some sort of context-dependent event. You can manipulate the activity of those neurons later to cause that animal to, well, if you change the activity in certain ways, you can decrease the activity, for instance, and then make it so that it forgets that memory completely. Or you can even force an animal to have a new memory associated with a different kind of sensory experience by activating that same ensemble.
Right. And you could even make them think that they were conscious of something that they weren't conscious.
Exactly. Because as long as you can identify what ensemble was needed to, say, generate that experience in the first place.
Right. But the point I was trying to get at is that when you accept that you have no way of knowing what you were conscious of 5 minutes ago, you have no way of knowing what the unconscious is. So I get rid of the distinction between unconscious and conscious, because that kind of thinking belongs down here. When we talk about what is unconscious, we're talking about what neurons are doing and all of that. But we're talking about subjective experience up here. And the point is that when you break, like, okay, if I don't know what I was conscious of 5 minutes ago, do I know what I was conscious of 5 seconds ago, 1 second ago, or do I know what I am actually conscious of right now? And my claim is that you do not, because as soon as you start thinking about it, you've done something different. Now you have new layers that are popping in. So you can never grab the occurrent.
You will never be able to grab the exact occurrence.
Right.
But you will have enough to survive and thrive. And to be, to make enough of a sufficient facsimile of whatever that experience was to convince another person that you did indeed experience that thing.
Right.
Yes.
But it's all smoke and mirrors. It's all smoke and mirrors.
I disagree with that. No,
you disagree?
Because I think what really is happening is that the actual sensory experience that you are experiencing at that moment gets entrained in ensembles of neurons that will initiate the immediate early gene changes in expression and the basic molecular mechanisms of memory that we know quite well. I mean, there's been Nobel Prizes handed out for some of this work that facilitates synaptic strengthening. So synaptic plasticity is one of the main mechanisms by which that collection of ensembles of neurons gets entrained, and it's basically recalling the sensory experience.
Yeah,
it is. And so therefore, if you remember it 5 minutes later, it's still active. When you are remembering, we know that it's reactivating those same neurons that were active during that time.
Yep.
and it's not just in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a big part of that, because the hippocampus, the brain isn't nearly as modular as we pretend it to be. It's an integrated, and you certainly appreciate this, like
Right.
it's a highly integrated system. The hippocampus receives input from portions of entorhinal cortex.
Yeah.
The hippocampus itself is made up of a bunch of different structures. There's a lot of processing that happens within the hippocampus itself. The output then goes to different portions of entorhinal cortex, which then goes on to other areas of cortex. Yeah, like it's really complicated, and all of that, like, actually is part of that sensory experience. And
all of that is happening, and there is no observer inside of us. There is no observer.
I mean,
as soon as you get to an observer, you're getting into dualism.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yes.
No, so what?
Well, it depends on how you define observer. Like an observer. Well,
I'm an observer.
Sure.
I'm observing.
There's no observer
right now. But the thing is that when we try to define consciousness that finely, it goes poof, it disappears, and that's what an illusionist is talking about.
I agree.
Eliminativist.
Yeah.
And the idea is that the only thing that we can accept is that we are like if you watch an insect scurrying across the cement, it kind of feels like there should be something it is to be that insect scurrying across that cement, right? Well, in our brains, we have scurrying systems and neurons, fields, floating around and shit happening. And it's almost like scurrying legs. And we have to accept that we are a processual phenomena.
Yes.
That we cannot feel, we cannot grab a piece of time. We can only do that on that physical line down there where, we can talk about 1 microsecond or 1 nanosecond. But we cannot do that with our minds. Our minds are like a brush going across time.
Yes.
And we're accumulating a whole bunch of time into one little thing that we call a qualia.
Yes, right.
And I think a lot of the things that we call unconscious aren't unconscious at all. They're the fabric of that qualia. We can feel them or sense them in some manner. They're contributing to the whole of what we are.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yes,
and
it's the sum total of those sensory experiences, and it obviously is rooted in the activity of neural networks, because we know what those activity of neural networks is, and especially when we talk about sensory systems, prior to the 50s or 60s, one could be forgiven for assuming that there must be some sort of ghost in the machine,
right?
That's allowing for perception and awareness and sensation, thoughts and emotions, all of those things that obviously where qualia would come from, that there must be some sort of ghost that's doing this. But at this point, that's silly, because we have such a thorough understanding of sensory systems and also motor output and even emotion. A lot of our understanding of the neuroscience of emotion and motivation, these things are not under the control of a ghost. We know that.
Yeah.
And so that's why I talk about it as the ghost of the gaps. So now consciousness just gets smaller and smaller, because people there's a certain segment that wants to define consciousness as this thing that can't be defined by neuroscience.
Yeah, the phenomenal consciousness.
Yes, exactly. And so like the hard problem of consciousness, as what's his face? I forget the leather wearing
Chalmers.
Yeah, Chalmers. Yes,
yeah.
The zombie guy.
He made his career on that shit.
Yes, I know that hard problem. Sure, but that hard problem keeps getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, and even free will.
Yeah.
When you start looking at the way the basal ganglia functions,
right?
Like if you're poised to grab something, there's this basically the indirect and the direct pathways are fighting with each other, and they're holding your hand still, and then all of a sudden the balance shifts and you go boom and you grab it. You say, "Oh, I willed that," right?
Yes, and basically the basal ganglia, it's a collection of a vast network of neural activity that certain fixed action patterns or patterns of movement or even ways of thinking and motivational habit forming type things, those are sort of they're set up over time through practicing or habit forming type things, like say smoking cigarettes or opening up a bar of like a Snickers bar and eating it and finding it very delicious. So you do it again, that kind of habit forming. There will be this collection of neurons that will be reinforced because it provides some sort of reward. And that is the direct pathway. But then the indirect pathway are all the other activities that the basal ganglia has to do, but that's being suppressed at that time because you can't have all those things happening all at once. Like you need to have your one fixed action pattern that you need to have at any one time in a very directional way. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. And what else was I going to say? Something else along those lines. Oh, yeah, and that brings us to I was reading about understanding language. As language is coming in, we categorize things, and basal ganglia has been implicated in all of that.
Yes.
So,
right.
So and in thinking and in sequentially thinking and going through sequences, and I'm sure the cerebellum has something to do with.
Yeah, the cerebellum is so understudied.
I know, and
it's surprising. I mean, it only makes up 10% of our brain's volume.
Yeah,
in the human brain. But do you know how many neurons are in the cerebellum?
I think isn't it 100 billion?
Well, okay, so our best number for the number of total neurons in a human brain is around 86 billion. That's what it is on average. So
and most of them are in the cerebellum, right?
So yes, most of them are in the cerebellum. So 80% of all the neurons in the brain are just in the cerebellum, and that means that 20% is in the rest of the brain. 90% of the brain's volume only has 20% of the brain's neurons.
Right. Yeah.
And that 10% of the brain's volume has 80% of the brain's neurons. Now,
and then
the cortex also has 19% of the brain's neurons, which means the rest of the brain has only 1% of the brain's neurons.
Yeah.
Which is wild to think about.
And the cerebellum seems to be like this amazingly almost crystal-like tensor calculator, right? It does tensor calculus.
Yes.
And now I read something recently about the savant syndrome. When the savant syndrome, there's a nucleus that's around, it's somewhere in the diencephalon, basal ganglia, I think, that becomes damaged. And you'll end up, I think what ends up happening is that cerebellar computer ends up being employed in things like mathematics and calendars and dates and all of that. And it's really accurate and it's really fast. I mean, you can grab a little tiny, like a mosquito, right? Fast enough. So it's a very, very precise computer.
Yes, because the cerebellum is primarily what we define it as, is that it's heavily involved in fine tuning of movement.
Yeah.
But also we know that it's involved in language too, to a big degree. And which of course requires fine tuning as well. It also is intended to create corrections for things that have already started, right? Like we're not just robots that just automatically do things because, I'm starting program A, therefore I am doing program A. The cerebellum is somehow paying attention to like in a very precise, very quick way of updating the brain and whatever program has already been initiated and making immediate changes to that. And that's why so it's loaded with GABAergic neurons, inhibitory neurons.
Yeah.
And the GABA is heavily affected by inebriation via alcohol.
Yeah.
And so when people are under the influence, they become very uncoordinated. And that is because one of the first areas of the brain to be heavily impacted by alcohol is the cerebellum because of all the GABA that's there. And so then you lose all that coordination. So slurring up speech and also inhibitions, right? Like
driving a car.
It certainly shouldn't be driving a car. Yes.
Be driving a car.
Now I gotta get going kind of soon, so I gotta wrap up if that's okay.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
How long did we go? Had we gone over an hour?
Yeah, we're at an hour and 15. It looks like.
Oh my goodness! Okay.
I know it flew. I lost track of time.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I should be going by like about 1:30, I think.
Okay. Yeah. The thing I was talking about with consciousness is the summation of about 15 or 20 years of my thinking about the subject, starting with Chalmers way back in the day and and fighting with a lot of people.
Right. Yes.
I did like 50,000 posts on forums
Really?
from probably 2008 until 2015, 16,
Nice.
something like that.
Yes.
But it was all
Chalmers is an interesting character. Like he's,
yeah.
I mean, a lot of his, he's a clever writer.
Oh yes,
and
brilliant.
Yes, right, absolutely, obviously. I mean, so Chalmers, for those who don't know, is an Oxford philosopher. He's at Oxford, I think, or Cambridge, one of those two. A philosopher who made famous the phrase "the hard problem of consciousness," and has basically ascribed consciousness to some must be. He doesn't say it's supernatural per se, but there must be some other force in the universe,
physical force,
yes, that we don't know, that's completely undescribed in order to explain consciousness. And it feels like, when you read his work, well, he just doesn't know enough neuroscience is really what it feels like.
Yeah, and well, reading his books frustrated me because he would seem to be him and John Searle. I don't know if you're familiar with Searle.
Yes.
Yeah. They would both be talking and I'd be like going along with them. It's like they were basically disproving their own thesis. And then all of a sudden, a paragraph later, they would come around out of the left field and affirm their thesis.
Right.
And I'm like, you just spent all of this time doing brilliant thinking about consciousness. And then you just totally scurried it aside and you came back to your original. And they both frustrated me so much because it seemed like they were arguing against themselves.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, hard problem of consciousness. It's got to be some other. And it's like, what? Listen to yourself.
We need a new physics to explain all of this.
Oh, and Chalmers came up with second order semantics and some really deep, in-depth theories about semantics to support his idea.
Right.
And he got so far into it that a lot of people just quit understanding him.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's one thing that is so frustrating about reading him in particular is that you read it and you feel like you're understanding it, but it gets to the point like, wait, I don't think I understand any of this, but I don't think that it makes any sense.
Right. It kind of sounds like
right. It's sort of like listening to Jordan Peterson go on about religion, like he sounds like he's making sense superficially, but then the more you listen to it, you're like, this doesn't make any sense. Like for when Jordan Peterson talks about like Exodus happened and it's still happening, and you're like, okay, I get what you mean. So you're talking about that there are these stories underlying humanity and our relationship to home, and that there's this mythos that we embrace as societies that seems to be largely universal across societies, and that some cultures have to move, but like that still doesn't tell me, do you think that Exodus actually happened? And then then you're like, well, what about the resurrection? And you're like, well, the resurrection happened and it's still happening. And then you're like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
No.
Somebody yesterday did a video on Jordan Peterson where it was Alex O'Connor, I think. He asked him, he said, if there was a camera, would Jesus popping out of the tomb be on that camera?
Yes.
Right. And I think Jordan Peterson said yes.
Okay.
I think he finally affirmed that he thinks it really happened.
Sure.
But then he went on, and there was so much bullshit after that.
Right. Because he knows that it's stupid. So, yeah.
Anyway, we got 5 minutes left. So
I got one question here from Blessed Be He.
Okay.
Why do you think physicalism is all there is? Dr. Chris, were you ever a Christian? So, all right, let me answer that. I actually grew up in a household that was Christian Scientists. This is something that not everyone knows what that is, but Christian Science, it was founded by Mary Baker Eddy in the late 1800s. She wrote a book called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She was part of, I think, the second revival in the United States of Christianity, where you also had the Seventh-day Adventists and others that kind of came about during that time. And so she founded another religion as well. Jehovah's Witness, I think, was part of that revival as well. So Christian Science was taking a more and more prominent role within society. She recognized that. And of course, science was taking a big role in health. We were learning more and more about germ theory and surgery and medicine. Obviously, it was still in its infancies in the late 1800s, but it was becoming more and more prominent. People realized that like logic and reasoning could be one way of actually dealing with health, instead of assuming that things are due to demonic possession or the humors or other things. The things that physical health problems is due to something spiritual. Mary Baker Eddy didn't believe that. She actually, if you look at the New Testament in particular, and especially in the Gospels, a big part of what Jesus did during the Gospels was going around and healing people and casting out demons. Like, that's a lot of what he did. All these miracles over and over again.
Yeah.
But also within the New Testament, he says, like, I'm not the only one who can do this. Through belief, you can do this too. He tells the apostles to go out and heal people. And so she took that seriously. She said, we should take this literally, and we're going to make this the core part of our religion. So that's why it's called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. So Christian scientists don't believe in medicine. They don't believe that it works, that these things are the result of spiritual, supernatural circumstances within you, and that through the power of prayer, you can cure yourself. Now, the household that I grew up in, my mother was getting farther away from Christian Science. She grew up strictly Christian Science. As she became an adult, we still went to Christian Science churches, but I didn't go very regularly. But that was the kind of environment that I was exposed to. And so I got bits and pieces of it. And I certainly believed some of that when I was a little kid. But once I got older and I started learning more about how the world really works, I like a lot of other Christian scientists who are very young, I ended up realizing that this is bunk. And if this is bunk, well, I think a lot of this is bunk.
Yeah.
So for a lot of people, like, Christian Science is a dying religion, that's for sure. It's losing more and more of its adherence every day because it's so utterly silly. We just don't, I think that a lot of the revivalist religions are silly because they're based on silly things, and some of them just don't make it. And therefore, it's just, they go away. And so that experience to me was enough to say, like, I got to look at these kinds of claims with a very skeptical set of glasses. And so I don't accept things just because it's written down in some sort of book, or because there is a well-paid preacher who is telling me that these things are indeed true, that I need to test them against the reality that I actually experience.
Yeah. I went through that whole transition when I was about 8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my mother exposed me to the Presbyterian Church. And it was an old country preacher named Mr. Peterson, or Reverend Peterson. And it was, and I decided that I was like getting into science at that time. And I decided none of this makes any sense, Mom. So I'm just not going to go anymore. And from then on, me and my mom were like at odds. All my life, she'd ask me, Mikey, are you still an atheist? It was amazing. We had this like counter going on from the time I was 8, but I feel bad for her. She was trying to bring me to the light,
I see. Yes.
Yeah.
See, and that, like, my experience being a Christian Scientist, most other Christians recognize that Christian Science is bunk. They say, like, yeah, like, obviously that's not true. But they don't go far enough to say, like, well, okay, some of this, why is it bunk?
Yep. So we have no time left.
I got to run, unfortunately.
What are you planning?
So I've been very busy with my research at the moment, trying to get some papers out. There's a paper coming out relatively soon. I got a new grant recently to look at lead toxicity and its effects on thyroid hormone in the developing brain. Okay. So I've been focusing a lot on that, and supporting my students. Now, I have a couple of things that I'm very interested in. I actually plan on doing a couple of videos on this thing that we just talked about, the McGilchrist video.
Yeah.
I think I might even work on that this weekend. I can't promise that it'll be up, But the other thing that I'm been more interested in lately is debates around abortion and in vitro fertilization in particular. You know, I think that there was that Georgia case that happened, or no, Alabama. It was Alabama that declared that in vitro fertilization, that embryos that are destroyed, so the person who accidentally destroys those embryos could be charged with negligent homicide for destroying an 8-cell embryo, and that 8-cell embryos are people. And so that brings up all kinds of interesting issues around development and around consciousness, and what do we define a person as? And when is a person? And
I recently got into development of the nervous system. And it doesn't look like there's anything going. There can't be anything going on in that brain for a long time.
Yes, absolutely. Right. Like there really isn't much of a cortex to talk of until about 18 weeks into development.
Other than growth cones, you know.
Yes, right. And it's not even all that developed at that point, and it's not connected to anything. So how can you have conscious thought? Like if you were to sever those connections from the cortex to the rest of the brain, you would have very little conscious thought at that point. And we do know that consciousness isn't entirely cortex driven. There's subcortical areas that are involved as well, but even they aren't all wired up in ways. But you know, the thing is, at the 8-cell stage, there's no brain. It's just 8 cells.
Right. Yep.
So to pretend that like that is a fully conscious human being is, I mean, they don't, of course, don't claim that. They just claim that it is a full human being at the 8-cell stage. And I think that there's some really interesting issues around that. For instance, what well, why do they define it as a human being? Like when does the soul enter the embryo? Like they would say at conception, I believe, right? So if the soul enters at conception, at that fertilized egg, so now you got a fertilized egg, and then it splits into 2 cells, right? And then you get 4, and then you get 8. But what happens if you take that 2-cell stage and you split those cells? Then you have
sons.
You have identical twins. But you would say that identical twins have separate souls, wouldn't you? So how did that happen?
Right.
And at the 8-cell stage, you can divide those 8 cells into separate cells. Those cells are pluripotent. You will have then octuplets that are identical.
Right. Well,
when does the soul enter?
My sons don't seem to have a soul, so
that's because they're identical twins.
That's right.
So anyway, I have ideas about that, and I want to play with that. And because we have an election coming up, I think abortion is going to be a major issue.
It's a big one,
and then I also think that the in vitro fertilization question is a really hot topic for some in the population, and I think people ignore the fact that it actually is really important for the overall abortion question as well. And I want to sort of tie some of those things together. So I've been playing with ideas about this.
A good friend of mine is having his 3rd child now with in vitro fertilization. He would not have had children at all.
Yes, exactly. Like it helps tens of thousands of people every single year in order to have their babies, you know, and then and this is one of the reasons why so many people on the right were very immediately took back their responses of like, oh well, you know, that Alabama Supreme Court case, we got to protect children. Oh wait a minute, actually that's not what we want. You know, this was a bad decision, but we should protect life. But you know, so like that got kind of covered up too quickly, and I want to go back and revisit some of that. That discussion, because there's a lot of interesting philosophical issues and scientific issues that I just don't think have been really wrestled with.
I'd love to be a part of any of those conversations.
As I create those videos, I'll definitely come back.
Okay.
Good deal.
Good enough. So we're going to end. Okay. Goodbye, cruel world.